Hey team, I'm so excited for our very first class and I want to talk to you about the very first assignment. Now, all of you are aspiring to be something else, a better communicator, a better leader, or you want to get promoted to another job. And what I want to challenge you to do is to think about the six traits of what that particular person embodies. And I'm going to give you an example. And what you're going to do next is that you're going to tell me a story, a personal story that backs up the fact from your career that you have that trait. And you're going to promise me something. I'm going to give you an example to really illustrate what this means. Since I was 4 years old, I wanted to be a television anchor, and every night at 6:30, my dad and I would sit down and watch Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tom Brokaw to me was the ultimate when it comes to television journalism. He had gravitas, he had presence, he was systematic, he was controlled, he was articulate. And one of the most important pieces that I gleaned at that very young age is that he had a high level of emotional intelligence. And if I wanted to be a great journalist, this was something that I needed to cultivate. Well, fast forward many years later, it's 2010, and I have a small documentary production company. We've raised $26,000, and we were going to spend 6 weeks boots on the ground in Tamil Nadu, India, to shoot this documentary. The subject was blindness in children, and I chose that because when you think about blindness, afflictions such as cataracts or glaucoma, that's something that's usually relegated to older people. But the fact that this was an epidemic among young children in India was something that I really wanted to tackle. Nothing's more emotional than kids. I tied up with a nonprofit that was going to allow me to be able to have access to these kids and access to the surgery. So fast forward now, it's December, I'm boots on the ground with my crew of 5 filming this particular documentary. And step 1 was that I needed to go into the children's ward and I needed to interview all 13 kids that were in the ward to figure out who were going to be my top 3 subjects that were going to be the characters that I wrapped my documentary around. Well, I remember walking into that ward, it was very blue. There was a lot of shades of seafoam and blue everywhere, and it was not so greatly lit, but there was this little boy who his face just leapt out of the crowd. He had such a pathos around him that you knew that he had a story. He had these big brown liquidy eyes and this velvet skin and just this very high cheekbones, but you could tell that that kid had a story. So I went through the due diligence, I interviewed all the other kids, but this kid, I didn't even care what his story was, I knew that there was something to tell. Now, when you are figuring out who your main characters are for a documentary, their narration has to be the backbone that the rest of the story sits on. So that means that this particular interview that we were about to conduct had to not only be perfect in sound, but it had to be very perfect in terms of picture. So we'd set everything up, we made sure everything was really perfect, and then I needed a translator because unfortunately for me, I did not speak Tamil. We were in a very, very remote part of India, so I needed to get one of the nurses or one of the medics to be my translator. And when you empower a civilian to be your translator, you know that they're speaking from their perspective and they're speaking through their lens and maybe even a bit of their agenda. I knew I was also in a very conservative part of South India, so I knew that that was going to really shape the way that she was going to be translating for me. So I went into this interview armed with all of that. I also knew a couple of things about this kid, that he was from a really poor part of India, his father was an alcoholic, and I suspected that maybe there was some abuse going on. So I was already armed with this information. So we sit down to do the interview. I'm sitting in a third chair, looking at the two of them facing each other and having a conversation. And the nurse starts to ask him questions. And here's the thing that I noticed. He was no holds barred. Like, he had nothing to lose and he was going to tell his story as unapologetically as possible. So she started to pull this out, that he had an alcoholic father. He was working at a local t-shirt factory as a teenager and bringing home money to support his 7 siblings, but more often than not, that money was usually taken by his father and then spent on the drink. So he's starting to tell his story. And I remember I kept prompting the nurse, yes, and. Yes, and, because I could tell, even though I didn't speak the language, that he had something to tell and he had a story to tell and he was going to tell it, but I had to keep pushing her because she was very willing to stop right there at a very sanitized version of his story. Yes, and Yes, and I kept pushing her. I could tell by his body language there was more there. Well, now it was 6 weeks had passed. I'd come back. I was stateside, and I got a professional translator to sit down and look at the tapes and translate for me. This kid, his name was Balaji. Balaji was about 11 years old, and he had a form of blindness that had set in, and it was irreversible. If his parents had brought him in anything earlier than 10 years old, it could have been reversible, but it was now, the wheels were set in motion. And he knew it. He had this wisdom beyond his years, and he knew that he sort of had this like death sentence that was impending for him, and he'd resigned himself to it. He also was a product of a home of intermarriage. So that meant that there was a chromosomal disorder that was affecting his retina, which is why his sight was deteriorating. And this really broke my heart, because he said, you know what, I'm just going to keep working until I can't. The important takeaway for this story is this. When, as a journalist, I'm interviewing somebody, it's not only important to focus on the elocution, the diction, what the person is saying. So much is buried in the unsaid, in the nonverbal cues, in the body language. Sometimes, in fact, this body language in this instance was 12 times more powerful to me than anything that was actually coming out of his mouth, because I didn't understand the language. So to me, high emotional intelligence is being able to parse out what's being said and what's in the unsaid, and therein lies the real magic of the story. So to recap, your assignment is that you're going to identify one trait, and that's the promise that you're going to give me at the outset of your story. Then I want you to look back on your entire career and harvest one personal story that buttresses the fact that you have this trait. And at the end, I want you to leave me, the audience, with a new conclusion. I told you that I thought that journalists need to have a high level of intelligence. I told you a story, but then I finished with the fact that sometimes what's in the unsaid is actually way more powerful. And that's something that I get to marinate on long after I've left your company. This is assignment 1. I can't wait to see you on Wednesday. I can't wait to see your presentations. You're going to get feedback from your peers. You're going to get feedback from me, and I can't wait to see you.